A fiery night, the dominant female CEO and the handsome man. One kiss led to passionate love. Welcome to the video, a message from the heart. In the name of the most merciful, the most kind. With a heart full of gratitude, I welcome you all to this beautiful journey we share together. As we begin today's video, I offer a sincere prayer for you. May your days be filled with light and your nights with peace. May your heart always find comfort, your soul always find purpose, and your life be blessed with love, happiness, and endless success. May every challenge bring you strength, and every blessing remind you of the beauty of life. Amen. I cannot express enough how deeply thankful I am for each and every one of you. Your kindness, your support, and your unwavering presence mean more than words can ever capture. This channel is not just mine. It belongs to all of us, to this beautiful family we have built together. For those who are new, welcome to a place of warmth, inspiration, and connection. And to my dear ones who have been here, your love is the foundation of this journey, and I am endlessly grateful. Thank you for believing in this vision. Thank you for every like, every comment, every share. You are not just viewers. You are a part of something greater, a community built on love, passion, and purpose. So let's begin this video with open hearts and eager minds. Stay with me till the end, because today we embark on something truly special. Let's dive in. The grand ballroom of the Orion Hotel shimmered under the glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, a dazzling reflection of the wealth and power gathered within its gilded walls. The air buzzed with conversations about mergers, stock values, and industry conquests, the sound blending seamlessly with the soft melody of a string quartet playing in the background. Waiters in crisp uniforms weaved through the crowd, silver trays in hand, offering glasses of the finest champagne to the elite of the business world. But despite the grandeur of the evening, despite the presence of billionaires and powerhouses dressed in their most exquisite attire, there was one presence that stood above the rest. Celine Ashford. The moment she entered, the room seemed to hush, if only for a fraction of a second. A presence like hers demanded attention, and attention was exactly what she received. Dressed in a crimson off-shoulder gown that hugged her curves with effortless elegance, she was the very definition of power, wrapped in allure. Her high heels clicked against the marble floors with purpose, each step a declaration of dominance, her posture regal and unwavering. Her dark hair cascaded in soft waves, framing a face that was both stunning and unreadable. Sharp cheekbones, full lips painted the color of sin, and eyes so piercingly cold they could silence even the most arrogant of men. Celine Ashford was not just a woman, she was a force of nature. She moved through the sea of elites with the air of a queen surveying her kingdom, her icy gaze scanning the crowd as if assessing who was worthy of her time. Few dared approach her. She had a reputation for making billion-dollar deals without batting an eyelash, for breaking competitors with a single calculated move. Celine was ruthless, unshakable, untouchable. Or so she thought. A deep, smooth voice interrupted her thoughts. I never thought I'd see the famous Celine Ashford looking so alone at a party like this. She turned, her sharp gaze meeting the source of the voice, and for the first time in a long while, she was momentarily caught off guard. He stood tall, effortlessly commanding attention, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean, athletic frame. His dark, tousled hair gave him a dangerously charming edge, while his piercing blue eyes held a challenge she wasn't used to facing. Confidence radiated from him, not the kind that begged for validation, but the kind that was deeply rooted in certainty, in power. She arched a perfectly shaped brow. And you are? Damien Locke, he introduced himself with a smirk, holding out his hand. Investor, businessman, and tonight, your most interesting conversation partner. Celine didn't shake his hand. Instead, She took a slow sip from her champagne glass, assessing him with the kind of scrutiny that would make most men squirm. But Damien wasn't most men. He simply waited, his gaze unwavering, that self-assured smirk never faltering. "Bold of you to assume I need company," she said smoothly, setting her glass down on a passing waiter's tray. "Not need," Damien corrected, stepping closer, his voice dipping slightly. "Want." A flicker of amusement passed through Selina's eyes, but before she could respond, a familiar voice sliced through the moment like a blade. "Celine, I didn't expect to see you here tonight." She turned her head slightly, her expression cooling as she faced Victor Langford, a rival CEO she despised. His sneering tone was one she had grown accustomed to over the years, his presence an annoyance she barely tolerated. "I assumed you'd be too busy tearing apart another company," he added with a smirk. Celine's lips curved into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Victor, how delightful. I was just thinking this party lacked its usual unpleasantness." Victor's smug grin faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. His gaze shifted to Damien, and his expression darkened with curiosity and disdain. "And who is this? Another business conquest?" Damien chuckled, entirely unbothered. "If I were, I doubt you'd be worth mentioning in the same breath." Celine tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into an approving smirk. "Clever," she murmured, the word meant for Damien alone. Victor's jaw clenched. "Enjoy the night while it lasts, Celine. Power doesn't make you untouchable." With that, he stalked away, his ego bruised, his pride dented. Damien turned back to her, his eyes filled with intrigue. "Charming man," she chuckled, a sound rare from her lips. "You handled him well." "I've dealt with worse." His gaze softened slightly, studying her with an intensity that felt almost personal. "And I'm guessing so have you." For the first time in years, Celine felt something unexpected, a strange warmth, a flicker of something foreign. Interest. "I don't do distractions," she warned, picking up another glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Damien leaned in just enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin, his voice a near whisper. "Then it's a good thing I'm not a distraction, Celine. I'm a challenge." He held her gaze for a lingering moment, then turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. And for the first time in a long time, Celine Ashford felt something more than power. She felt intrigued, and that perhaps was the most dangerous feeling of all. Celine prided herself on her ability to remain unaffected, to keep her emotions locked away behind steel walls. It was what had made her one of the most formidable CEOs in the business world. Her reputation was built on unwavering control, on calculated decisions that left no room for vulnerability. And yet, as she sat in the back of her sleek black limousine, the city lights blurring past the tinted windows, her mind refused to obey her command. It kept drifting back to him, Damien Locke, a man who had looked her in the eye and seen past the cold facade she had perfected over the years. A man who had met her with challenge instead of intimidation, with interest instead of awe. He had been different, unshaken, intriguing. Celine exhaled slowly, willing herself to shake off the lingering sensation of his piercing gaze. She had been admired before, had been pursued by men who thought they could tame the ice queen of the corporate world. None had succeeded. None had even come close. She had no reason to believe Damien would be any different, and yet something about him lingered. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a message from her assistant, a reminder about the early board meeting scheduled for the next morning. With a sigh, she leaned back against the plush leather seat and massaged her temple. It was late, and she needed rest. She had an empire to run, and distractions were not a luxury she could afford. But just as she was about to set the phone aside, another message flashed across the screen. An unknown number. Thinking about me? Her pulse did a strange little skip. She arched an eyebrow, considering. There were only a handful of people who would dare to text her at this hour, and she had a feeling she knew exactly who it was. A slow smirk touched her lips as she typed her response. You assume too much. Barely a second passed before another message came through, not an assumption, just an observation. Celine chuckled softly. Bold. He was persistent, she had to give him that. But she wasn't one to be easily played. I don't play games, Damien. Who said this was a game? A slow, dangerous thrill curled in her stomach. She wasn't sure if it was the challenge in his words or the way he refused to be intimidated by her usual icy responses. But something about Damien Locke was undeniably enticing. The car came to a smooth halt in front of her penthouse. The chauffeur stepped out to open her door, and the cool night air met her skin as she emerged, her heels clicking against the pavement. The towering glass structure of her building loomed above her, a stark reminder of the life she had built. A life of control, of power, of solitude. She took a breath and stepped inside, the private elevator carrying her to the top floor. As the doors slid open, she walked into the lavishly designed space that was her sanctuary, minimalistic, modern, and devoid of unnecessary emotion, just like her. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt something foreign, a spark of anticipation, of curiosity, of something dangerously close to excitement. As she set her clutch down and slipped out of her heels, her phone vibrated again. Good night, Celine. Sweet dreams. She stared at the message for a moment before typing back. Don't count on it. A challenge. One he would undoubtedly accept. As she slid into bed, staring up at the ceiling, she realized something unsettling. She wasn't sure if she wanted to win this game or lose to him completely. The morning sun had barely risen above the skyline when Celine Ashford stepped into the towering glass structure of Ashford Enterprises. The air inside was crisp, filled with the quiet hum of efficiency as employees bustled about, their conversations hushed, their gazes sharp with determination. But the moment she entered, an invisible force seemed to ripple through the space. Heads turned, backs straightened. The Queen had arrived. Celine's heels clicked against the polished marble floor as she made her way toward the executive elevators, her assistant, Mara, hurrying beside her with a tablet in hand. Her morning had begun the way it always did, with precision, control, and an unwavering focus on business. Your 9 o'clock meeting with the board is set, Mara reported briskly, swiping through her schedule. Mr. Langford has requested a reschedule on the contract negotiations, and the design team needs final approval for the marketing campaign. Celine nodded, barely breaking stride. Tell Langford he'll meet at the originally scheduled time, or not at all, and push the marketing team's meeting to after lunch. Mara hesitated for a second before adding, also, Damien Locke's office reached out this morning. Celine's steps faltered for a fraction of a second, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but Mara had been working with her long enough to notice. And? Celine asked, keeping her voice smooth and unaffected. They requested a lunch meeting. Apparently he has a proposal for you. Celine exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. Damien Locke, the man who had walked into her world uninvited and left an imprint she couldn't quite erase. She hadn't expected to hear from him so soon, but perhaps she should have. He had the confidence of a man who didn't believe in waiting. Tell them I'll consider it, she said coolly, knowing full well she had already made up her mind. Hours later, Celine found herself seated in one of the most exclusive rooftop restaurants in the city. The air was thick with the scent of fresh basil and citrus, mingling with the expensive perfume of the elite patrons dining around them. But Celine barely noticed, because across from her, Damien Locke sat with a knowing smirk, his piercing blue eyes watching her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "You don't waste time," she noted as she lifted her wineglass to her lips, taking a slow sip. "Neither do you," Damien countered smoothly, setting his own glass down. "That's why I know we'd make a powerful team." Celine arched a perfectly shaped brow. "Is that what this is about? Business?" Damien's smirk deepened, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Not just business, something more dynamic." There it was, the unspoken undercurrent that had been there since the moment they met. It wove through every glance, every challenge, every sharp-edged word exchanged between them. Celine tilted her head slightly, assessing him. She wasn't a woman easily swayed. And yet, something about Damien made her pulse race in a way she couldn't ignore. He was dangerous, not in the way of reckless men who acted without thought, but in the way of men who knew exactly what they wanted, and were patient enough to get it. She leaned forward slightly, a slow smile curving her lips. "And what exactly are you proposing, Damien?" His gaze darkened, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "A merger." She exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "I don't do mergers." "Not even when they're mutually beneficial?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly, threading through the space between them like a challenge. Selina knew he wasn't just talking about business anymore, and she hated how much she wanted to find out just how far this conversation could go. The tension between them was palpable, stretching like a live wire, crackling with something dangerous and tempting all at once. It had been a long time since anyone had managed to unnerve her, and she wasn't sure if she despised Damien for it, or if she was intrigued beyond reason. Finally, she set her glass down and met his gaze head-on. "Tell me, Damien, are you always this persistent?" His smirk softened into something almost sincere. "Only when something is worth the chase." Celine should have walked away. She should have shut this down before it turned into something uncontrollable. But instead, she let herself linger in the moment just a little longer. And she had a feeling she was about to break her own rules. Celine Ashford wasn't a woman easily thrown off balance, but Damien Locke had a way of rattling the very foundation of her control. As she sat across from him at the high-end rooftop restaurant, the skyline stretching endlessly behind him, she was acutely aware of the tension in the air, thick, electric and undeniable. She stirred her wineglass slowly, eyes locked onto his with an expression of cool indifference, though her pulse betrayed her. Damien, as usual, was too composed, too collected. His confidence was infuriating, and yet, somehow, intoxicating. "So, you want a collaboration," Celine mused, tilting her head slightly. "And what exactly do you think I can offer you that you don't already have?" Damien leaned forward, his fingers tracing the rim of his whiskey glass. His gaze never wavered. "You know exactly what you bring to the table, Celine. Power, strategy, a mind that's always 2 steps ahead. The question is, are you willing to take a risk?" Celine chuckled, low and dangerous. "Risks are for those who don't know how to play the game." Damien smirked. "And yet, here you are, entertaining my proposition instead of walking away." Her lips parted, but before she could respond, a sharp voice interrupted them. "Well, well, if it isn't the untouchable Celine Ashford." Celine's expression hardened instantly. Victor Langford. Again. Dressed in his usual tailored arrogance, Victor strode toward their table with a smirk that made Celine's blood boil. She despised him, not just as a business rival, but as a man who thrived on belittling strong women as if their existence threatened his fragile ego. I was just about to say the same about you, Victor, Celine said, her voice smooth but cutting. Still clinging to your outdated tactics? Victor's gaze flickered to Damien, sizing him up before letting out a mocking laugh. And who is this? Another man who thinks he can tame the infamous Ice Queen? Celine's fingers tightened around her wineglass. Damien, however, remained unnervingly relaxed. I don't need to tame her, Damien said coolly, swirling his drink. Unlike you, I know better than to underestimate her. Victor's smirk faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Interesting company you keep, Celine. But I'll warn you, getting too close to her is like playing with fire. Damien met Victor's gaze without flinching. Funny, I was about to say the same thing. Celine felt an unexpected warmth curl in her chest. Damien was defending her, not that she needed it, but the gesture itself was intriguing. Victor scoffed. Enjoy your little games while they last. He turned to Celine, his smirk widening. We'll see who really wins when the upcoming bid results are announced. With that, he walked away, leaving behind a trail of tension. Celine exhaled slowly. He never knows when to quit. Damien took a sip of his drink, watching her with interest. Neither do you. Their eyes met, the intensity between them sharp and undeniable. You didn't need to step in, Celine finally said, breaking the silence. I know. Damien set down his glass, leaning closer. But I wanted to. Celine didn't look away. You don't strike me as the type to waste effort on things that don't matter. Damien's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. Who said you don't matter? The words sent a shiver down her spine. He was pushing boundaries, testing her defenses. And the most dangerous part? She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to stop him. She could feel the shift the moment the air between them changed. This wasn't just business anymore. This was something far more dangerous. And for the first time in a long time, Celine wasn't certain she wanted to walk away. The following morning, Celine was back in her element. The walls of Ashford Enterprises towered around her, a fortress of power and control. Meetings, reports, negotiations. Everything moved like clockwork, just as she had built it. But even as she sat in her glass-walled office, overseeing the empire she had worked so hard to create, a distraction lingered in the back of her mind. Damien Locke, his words, his presence, the way he had looked at her, as if he saw past every calculated mask she wore. Ma'am, her assistant Mara's voice cut through her thoughts. Mr. Locke has requested a private meeting with you. Celine's heartbeat quickened, an unwelcome betrayal. She steeled her expression. Tell him I'm unavailable. A pause. Then, he said you might say that, Mara said hesitantly. So he left a message. You can ignore me, but you can't ignore what's already started. Celine clenched her jaw, annoyance flickering through her. Damien was relentless, and annoyingly he was right. She tapped her nails against the desk, considering. Then, exhaling softly, she made her decision. Schedule the meeting, she said, but on my terms. Because if Damien Locke wanted a challenge, she was more than ready to give him one. The morning sun cast golden hues across the skyline, reflecting against the towering glass windows of Ashford Enterprises. Inside her private office, Celine Ashford sat behind her sleek, dark mahogany desk, a paragon of power and discipline. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored ivory blazer and pencil skirt, her hair pinned in a flawless bun, exuding an aura of cool detachment. Everything was as it should be, structured, controlled, predictable. And yet, something felt different today. Something felt off. No matter how much she tried to push it away, a single name kept intruding into her mind, disrupting her perfectly crafted focus. Damien Locke. She despised distractions, despised the way his words from the night before clung to her thoughts like an unwelcome melody she couldn't shake. He had been persistent, too composed, too confident. Most men either feared her or sought to conquer her. But Damien, he had done neither. Instead, he had met her at eye level, daring her to challenge him, to acknowledge the undercurrent between them. Her manicured fingers drummed lightly against the surface of her desk as she forced herself back into the present. She had an empire to run, and Damien Locke was nothing more than a momentary disturbance, one she would swiftly eliminate from her mind. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant, Mara, stepped inside, her expression cautious yet professional. "Ma'am, Mr. Locke has requested a private meeting with you." Selina's pulse spiked, a reaction she swiftly buried beneath an icy exterior. Her fingers stilled on the desk. "Tell him I'm unavailable." Mara hesitated, shifting on her feet. "He said you might say that." She glanced at her tablet before meeting Celine's gaze again. "He left a message. You can ignore me, but you can't ignore what's already started." Celine inhaled slowly through her nose. The audacity of that man. Her instinct told her to shut him out completely, to send a clear message that she was untouchable, immovable, unyielding. But another part of her, the part that had felt the rush of challenge in Damien's presence, hesitated. He had intrigued her, and that was something no one had managed to do in years. She exhaled sharply, making her decision. "Schedule the meeting," she said, standing from her chair. "But on my terms." Mara nodded and left the room, and Celine turned towards the floor-to-ceiling windows, arms crossed, her mind already calculating. If Damien Locke wanted to push boundaries, she would show him exactly what it meant to stand on the edge. An hour later, her door swung open, and Damien Locke stepped inside with an air of effortless confidence. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, the dark fabric hugging his broad shoulders and lean frame in a way that made her stomach tighten. He exuded wealth and power, but there was something else beneath it, something raw, something untamed. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers as he shut the door behind him, the room instantly charged with an unspoken tension. Celine remained seated, her expression unreadable. "You're persistent," he smirked, stepping forward with deliberate ease. "You're worth it." Her jaw clenched slightly. "Flattery doesn't work on me, Damien." "Who said I was flattering you?" He leaned against the chair across from her desk, his gaze unrelenting. "I'm simply stating a fact." Celine arched a brow. "And I suppose you're here to convince me of that fact." "No." His voice was smooth, measured. "I'm here to see how long it'll take before you admit you already know it's true." A flicker of something dangerously close to amusement crossed her face before she pushed it away. "If you have a business proposition, get to the point. Business is always on your mind, isn't it?" He observed her like he was peeling away layers she had long since fortified. "But tell me, Celine, when was the last time you allowed yourself to want something that had nothing to do with power?" Her breath hitched, just barely, but it was enough for Damien to catch. He tilted his head slightly, a knowing glint in his eyes. He was testing her, pushing her, and worse, he was enjoying it. She stood abruptly, moving around the desk, closing the distance between them. "You assume too much," she said, her voice cool as she stopped just inches from him. Damien didn't step back. He held his ground, his presence overwhelming, intoxicating. "Do I?" he murmured, gaze flickering to her lips for just a second before returning to her eyes. Celine felt the air shift, felt the invisible line between them waver. She reached forward, her fingers brushing along his tie before gripping it firmly, her lips curving slightly. "You're playing a dangerous game, Damien." A slow, knowing smile tugged at his lips. "I never back down from a challenge." "Neither do I," she whispered. For a moment, they remained locked in place, Two forces colliding, neither willing to surrender. The tension coiled tighter, an invisible thread pulling them closer, daring them to step over the edge. Then, as if realizing just how thin the line was, Selene released his tie, taking a single step back. "If you have a proposal, send it to my legal team." Damien chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You can pretend all you want, Selene, but we both know something has already started between us. And it's only a matter of time before you stop fighting it." She forced her expression into a mask of indifference, though her pulse betrayed her. "I don't fight battles. I don't intend to win." He took a slow step back, his gaze never leaving hers. "Neither do I." With that, he turned and walked out of her office, leaving behind the unmistakable scent of his cologne and the lingering remnants of a battle neither of them had truly won. Selene exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to her desk to steady herself. Because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if this was a battle she wanted to win, or one she wanted to surrender to completely. Selene had spent years mastering the art of restraint. Every decision she made, every move in her career, was calculated. She had learned that emotions were a liability in the ruthless world of business. And yet, as she sat in her office, staring at the city skyline, she realized that her well-constructed walls were beginning to crack. Because of him. Damien Locke. His name alone sent a shiver down her spine, an unfamiliar sensation that both thrilled and unnerved her. Their meeting earlier had ended, but the remnants of their encounter clung to her like a whispered promise. She could still see the challenge in his eyes, feel the heat of his presence lingering in the air long after he had walked out of her office. Selene leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment, willing herself to push aside the distraction. But it was impossible. Damien had embedded himself in her thoughts like a song she couldn't stop replaying. A soft knock at the door pulled her back to reality. Mara, her assistant, stepped in hesitantly. "Ms. Ashford, Mr. Locke has sent something for you." Selene arched a brow. "Something?" Mara stepped forward, placing a sleek black box on her desk. "It arrived just now. There was a note attached." Selene's pulse quickened as she reached for the small envelope resting on top. Her fingers slid beneath the flap, pulling out the elegant card within. "For the woman who claims not to play games. I wonder, Selene, do you always think this much before making a move, or am I just an exception?" To her breath hitched. Damn him. She glanced at the box, hesitating for a fraction of a second before lifting the lid. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a single chess piece, the queen. Selene let out a small, incredulous laugh. He was playing with fire, but so was she. Mara watched her carefully. "Would you like me to send a response?" Selene smirked, a new determination lighting in her gaze. "No," she murmured, picking up the queen and rolling it between her fingers. "I think I'll handle this one personally." That evening, Selene arrived at an exclusive bar tucked away in the heart of the city. It was one of those places only the elite knew about, dimly lit, exuding luxury, where business moguls and power players came to unwind. She spotted him instantly. Damien sat in a corner booth, a glass of whiskey in his hand, exuding effortless confidence. He saw her the moment she stepped inside, his lips curving into that maddening smirk she was beginning to crave more than she should. She approached with the same poised elegance that made her a force to be reckoned with in the boardroom. When she reached the table, she wordlessly pulled the chess piece from her purse and placed it in front of him. "Bold move," she murmured, sliding into the seat across from him. Damien picked up the queen, examining it with a slow, deliberate motion. "And here I thought you didn't play games." Selene tilted her head. "I don't, but I do enjoy strategy." His blue eyes darkened with intrigue. "Then let's stop pretending we don't know where this is heading." She exhaled softly, her fingers curling around the stem of the wine glass the server placed before her. "And where do you think it's heading, Damien?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping just enough to send a shiver down her spine. "Somewhere neither of us planned for." Their gazes locked, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Celine knew this was dangerous. She had spent years ensuring that no one got close enough to touch her, to break through the barriers she had carefully erected. But Damien Locke wasn't asking for permission to enter her world. He was already inside, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to push him out. The conversation between them continued, a dance of wit and unspoken desires. He challenged her, tested her limits, made her pulse race in a way no one else ever had. And when the night drew to a close, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "Be careful, Celine," he murmured, his touch sending electricity up her arm. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back." She held his gaze, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. "Then maybe it's time we stop pretending there's a line at all." Damien's smirk deepened. "I was hoping you'd say that." Celine knew this was a risk. But as his fingers entwined with hers, she also knew some risks were worth taking. When temptation strikes, Celine had spent years building an empire where emotions had no place. She had learned that love and passion were distractions, luxuries that could cost her everything. But as she stood in her office, staring at the city lights through the vast glass windows, she knew she was already losing control. Damien Locke was a storm she hadn't prepared for. He was relentless, unpredictable, and maddeningly confident. And worst of all, he was getting under her skin. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said, her voice steady, even as her heart wasn't. The door opened, and there he was. Damien stepped inside, his presence filling the room like a force of nature. Dressed in his usual impeccable suit, he carried himself with the kind of ease that suggested he owned the very air he breathed. "You're working late," he observed, his gaze sweeping over her desk, cluttered with reports and documents. "So are you," she countered, arching a brow. "What do you want, Damien?" He smirked, taking a slow step toward her. "Straight to the point. I like that about you." She crossed her arms, refusing to let his proximity rattle her. "If you came here to flirt, I suggest you try elsewhere." "Oh, I didn't come to flirt," he said smoothly, stopping just a breath away from her. "I came because we both know there's something here, and I think you're finally ready to admit it." Her pulse betrayed her, but she refused to let it show. "You assume too much." "Do I?" He reached out, his fingers lightly grazing the sleeve of her blouse. "Then tell me why you're not stopping me." The air between them was charged, a dangerous current neither of them seemed willing to break. Celine knew she should push him away, re-establish the barriers she had carefully built around herself. But instead, she found herself searching his gaze, drawn to the fire within it. "Damien," she warned, her voice softer now, betraying the conflict waging inside her. He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. "Tell me to leave," he murmured, "and I will." Celine opened her mouth, but the words never came. Because the truth was, she didn't want him to leave. She wanted to know what would happen if she let herself fall just this once. And in the next heartbeat, she closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that shattered every rule she had ever made. It was fire and fury, a clash of power and passion that left them both breathless. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her closer as she surrendered to the hunger she had fought for so long. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling in the silence, Celine met his gaze, her heart hammering in her chest. "This changes nothing," she whispered, even as she knew it was a lie. Damien smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You keep telling yourself that." Celine knew she was playing with fire, and for the first time in her life, She wanted to burn. Celine stirred, the faint light of dawn slipping through the sheer curtains of her penthouse bedroom. The city outside had yet to fully awaken, the distant hum of traffic muted against the silence in the room. For a fleeting moment, she let herself drift between sleep and wakefulness, cocooned in warmth, in comfort. Then, reality crept in. Her body ached in ways she hadn't felt in a long time. Reminders of the night before, of heated touches, whispered words, and lips that had traced fire along her skin. Her pulse quickened, memories crashing into her with force. The weight of another presence beside her became undeniable. She turned her head, heart pounding against her ribs, as her gaze fell upon Damien Locke. He lay beside her, bare-chested, one arm lazily draped over his abdomen. The sheets rested low on his waist, revealing hard lines and sculpted muscle. His dark hair was deliciously tousled, his face relaxed in sleep, a stark contrast to the usual sharp, calculating expression he wore like armor. The ghost of a smirk lingered on his lips, as if even in dreams he was winning some unseen game. Celine inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the silk sheets. What had she done? Panic coiled in her chest, her meticulously crafted control fracturing under the weight of the night before. She had spent years building walls, ensuring no one got close enough to slip past them. And yet, here she was, tangled in bed with the one man who had made her forget herself. She needed to leave. No, she needed him to leave. Carefully, she slid her legs over the edge of the bed, trying to move without disturbing him. But just as she was about to rise, his voice, thick with sleep and amusement, cut through the silence. Thinking of running, beautiful. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned back to find his blue eyes, piercing, knowing, watching her with lazy curiosity. He stretched, muscles flexing, his smirk deepening as if he had just caught her in the middle of a delicious game. "Last night was a mistake," she stated firmly, gripping the sheet around her like a shield. Damien propped himself up on one elbow, watching her with a mix of amusement and something far more dangerous. "Was it? Because I recall you pulling me closer, not pushing me away." Heat flared up her neck, but she refused to let him see her falter. "We got carried away." He reached out, tucking a stray strand of her dark hair behind her ear, his fingers grazing her skin just enough to make her shiver. "Carried away? That's one way to put it. Another would be that you wanted me just as much as I wanted you." Her lips parted, a sharp retort forming, but the look in his eyes stole her breath. There was no arrogance in his gaze now, just certainty, a deep understanding that rattled her in ways she wasn't prepared for. "This doesn't mean anything," she forced out. Damien exhaled a soft laugh, shaking his head. "You can keep telling yourself that, Celine, but we both know better." The weight of his words pressed down on her, stirring something raw and unguarded within her. She clenched her jaw and stood abruptly, wrapping the sheet around her as she strode toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, a stark reminder of the world she ruled, a world where emotions had no place. He watched her, unbothered, stretching out lazily against her pillows. "Tell me something," he mused. "If I kissed you right now, would you push me away?" Her breath caught. She could feel him moving before she saw him. Damien rose from the bed, walking toward her with unhurried steps like a predator closing in. He stopped just behind her, his heat searing against her back. "Tell me to leave," he murmured, his lips ghosting over the shell of her ear. "And I will." Celine squeezed her eyes shut. The rational part of her screamed to do just that, to end whatever this was before it spiraled further out of her control. But then he placed his hands on her waist, his touch grounding, anchoring her in a way that made her want to lean into him instead of away. She turned her head slightly, enough to catch his gaze, a storm brewing between them. "Get dressed, Damien. I have work to do." He chuckled, but there was no disappointment in his expression, only patience. "As you wish, boss." She held her breath as he stepped back, retrieving his scattered clothes from the floor. The moment he disappeared into the adjoining bathroom, Celine exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temples. This was dangerous, reckless, a line she shouldn't have crossed. And yet, as she caught sight of her reflection in the glass, flushed skin, swollen lips, the undeniable mark of Damien Locke, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not even close. Celine spent the entire day buried in work, hoping the numbers on her screen would distract her from the lingering memory of last night. She had gone over the quarterly reports twice, held back-to-back meetings, and even reviewed legal contracts, tasks that usually commanded her full focus. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase the way Damien had looked at her, as if he saw right through the walls she had spent years building. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but instead of typing, her mind replayed the events of the night before. The feel of his lips, the way his hands had traced over her skin, the sheer intensity of their connection. It had been reckless, impulsive, everything she wasn't, and yet she had let it happen. By evening, she was restless. A part of her expected him to barge into her office, flashing that signature smirk, teasing her, pushing her boundaries just to see if she'd push back. But he didn't. He had stayed silent all day. That was worse. It wasn't like Damien to hold back. He thrived on the chase, on getting under her skin. His absence unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Just as she was about to leave, a message popped up on her phone. "Meet me at Le Jardin. 9 p.m. Don't keep me waiting." Celine hesitated, her fingers tightening around the device. Meeting him was a bad idea, a terrible one. But before she could talk herself out of it, she found herself typing a response. "I don't take orders." The reply came almost instantly. "Good. Then consider it an invitation. One I know you won't refuse." She exhaled sharply, tossing her phone onto the desk. Her better judgment screamed at her to ignore him, to put last night behind her and move on. But her heart was already betraying her logic. Le Jardin was one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, known for its lush rooftop garden, soft candlelit ambiance, and impeccable service. When Celine arrived, she was greeted by the maitre d' and led to a private table tucked away in an intimate corner. Damien was already there, dressed in a crisp black suit, a glass of wine in his hand. He rose as she approached, his gaze darkening with something unreadable, something dangerous. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted, pulling out her chair. "I shouldn't have," she replied coolly, even as her pulse betrayed her calm facade. His smirk was slow, knowing. "Yet here you are?" She sat down, crossing one leg over the other, regaining her composure. "If this is about business, then say what you need to say." Damien chuckled, swirling his wine. "Oh, Celine, always so eager to keep things professional. And yet, last night wasn't exactly professional, was it?" Her stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Last night was a lapse in judgment. If that's what helps you sleep at night." She exhaled sharply. "What do you want, Damien?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping into something softer, more intimate. "I want to know why you're fighting this so hard." Celine met his gaze, her defenses rising instinctively. "Because I don't mix business with pleasure." His lips twitched. "Liar!" she bristled. "Excuse me." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "If that were true, you wouldn't have let last night happen, and you wouldn't be here now." A waiter arrived, breaking the tension momentarily as they ordered. Celine took the moment to gather herself, but the second they were alone again, Damien was right back to pushing her. This thing between us, Celine, it's not going away, he continued, his voice low, seductive. You feel it just as much as I do. She picked up her wineglass, taking a measured sip before responding. What I feel is irrelevant. It doesn't change anything. Damien smirked. Doesn't it? She refused to let him see how much he was affecting her. We both have reputations to uphold. Getting involved is a mistake. Some mistakes, he murmured, tracing the rim of his glass, are worth making. Celine's breath hitched slightly, but she masked it with a carefully placed smirk. You think you have me all figured out, don't you? I know I do. His confidence was maddening, but God help her. It was also intoxicating. The rest of the evening was a careful dance, a game of push and pull. They teased, challenged, and tested each other, each refusing to give the other the upper hand. But beneath the words, the tension simmered, unspoken, yet undeniable. By the time they finished dinner, the night had cooled, the city lights casting a soft glow over the rooftop. Damien walked her to her car, his fingers brushing against hers as they stood in the quiet of the parking lot. Celine, he murmured, his voice softer now. You can keep pretending this is nothing, but we both know the truth. Her heart pounded. And what truth is that? His gaze searched hers, and for a brief moment the teasing was gone. He was raw, open, honest. That this, whatever this is between us, is far from over. She swallowed hard. He was right, and she hated that he was right. Because despite every reason she had to walk away, despite every warning in her head, she couldn't seem to shake him. Instead of answering, she stepped back, reaching for the car door handle. Good night, Damien. His smirk returned, but there was something else in his eyes now, something deeper, for now. As she drove away, Selina let out a slow breath, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. This wasn't over, not even close. Selina tried to convince herself that last night's dinner with Damien had been nothing more than a mistake, a moment of weakness. But the way he had looked at her, the way his voice had wrapped around her name, it lingered in her mind like an intoxicating melody she couldn't forget. She arrived at her office early the next morning, determined to regain control. Everything had a place, and everything had an order. Her emotions, especially, had to remain locked away. She had spent too many years perfecting that skill to let one man unravel her now. But the moment she stepped inside, her breath hitched. Damien was already there, leaning casually against her desk, flipping through a file as if he owned the place. "You're in my chair," she stated, masking the quickening of her pulse. He smirked, shutting the file and standing up slowly. "Good morning to you too, boss." Selina exhaled sharply, setting her purse down. "What do you want, Damien?" He stepped closer, his gaze locked onto hers. An answer. She stiffened. "To what?" He tilted his head slightly, studying her like a puzzle he was determined to solve. "To whatever this is between us." "There is no this," she said firmly, though even she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. Damien chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a terrible liar, Celine." He reached for her hand, his touch warm against her skin. "Every time you push me away, you pull me back in twice as hard." She snatched her hand away, turning toward the window, willing herself to breathe, to think, to regain the control he so easily stripped from her. "This can't happen, Damien. I don't mix business with pleasure." He moved behind her, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Is that really the reason? Or are you just scared?" Celine closed her eyes briefly, willing herself to stay strong. But the scent of him, the heat radiating from his body, it was all-consuming. "I'm not scared," she whispered, but even she didn't believe it. Damien gently brushed her hair off her shoulder, his lips hovering just above her skin. Then prove it. She turned swiftly, only to find herself inches from him. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. The war inside her raged, logic against desire, control against surrender. Then, before she could stop herself, she grabbed his collar and pulled him into a kiss. It was electric, desperate, a collision of fire and restraint unraveling all at once. Damien groaned against her lips, deepening the kiss, his arms wrapping around her waist. Celine clung to him, surrendering to the storm she had tried so hard to deny. The sound of someone clearing their throat shattered the moment. Celine pulled away, breathless, and turned to see her assistant standing awkwardly in the doorway. I have the reports you requested," she stammered. Flustered, Celine straightened her blouse and took the files. "Thank you, Mia." Mia nodded quickly and exited, leaving behind a charged silence. Damien smirked, adjusting his tie. "I think we just broke your no-mixing business with pleasure rule." Celine sighed, pressing her fingers to her temples. "This is a mistake." "If that's what helps you sleep at night," Damien said, leaning down to whisper against her ear. "But we both know you'll wake up wanting me all over again." Her body betrayed her with a shiver, but she forced herself to step away. "Get back to work, Damien." He grinned, walking toward the door. "As you wish, boss." As soon as he was gone, Celine sank into her chair, her heart racing. She had always been in control, always dictated the rules. But with Damien, she was playing a dangerous game, and she was starting to think she wanted to lose. The night air carried a delicate whisper of lavender and distant city lights as Celine stepped onto the rooftop lounge. The hum of the city below seemed far away, a mere backdrop to the storm of emotions raging within her. She had spent the entire day fighting the memory of his kiss, of the way Damien had held her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world. And yet, despite every logical argument she had thrown at herself, she was here. Her phone vibrated once more in her hand, as if urging her forward. "Meet me at the rooftop lounge at 8. No business talk. Just us." She had hesitated before answering, had stared at the blinking cursor as though it held all the answers she needed, but something inside her, a part she rarely listened to, had typed out the word yes and pressed send. Now, as she took tentative steps onto the beautifully lit terrace, she felt her pulse hammer in her chest. The ambiance was breathtaking. Tiny golden lights adorned the space, flickering like stars against the deep velvet sky. A private table had been set up beneath the open sky, draped in white linen and set with delicate crystal glasses that reflected the soft candle light. Everything about it felt intimate, like a scene plucked from a dream. And at the center of it stood Damien. He turned at the sound of her approach, his expression unreadable for the briefest of moments before a slow, devastating smile curved his lips. Dressed in a dark blazer with an open-collared shirt, he looked both effortless and impossibly alluring. The sight of him sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "You came," he murmured, rising from his seat as she stepped closer. "I must be out of my mind," she replied, her voice softer than she had intended. Damien chuckled, a low, rich sound that wrapped around her like silk. "Or maybe," he said, reaching for a bottle of wine resting in an ice bucket, "you're finally giving in to what you really want." Celine narrowed her eyes as she took the seat across from him. "And what exactly do I want, Damien?" He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto hers, the city lights reflected in his dark eyes, making them shimmer with intensity. "Me." The confidence in his voice made her heart stumble. She wrapped her fingers around the stem of her wine glass, as if the fragile crystal could somehow steady her. "You're awfully sure of yourself." "I only say what I know to be true," he murmured, taking a slow sip of his drink. He set the glass down and rested his forearms on the table, his hands dangerously close to hers. "Tell me I'm wrong." Celine opened her mouth, ready to protest, to deny, to retreat into the safety of her carefully built walls. But nothing came, because he wasn't wrong. Every stolen moment with him had chipped away at her resistance. Every touch, every lingering glance had unraveled her defenses piece by piece. She had spent weeks convincing herself that Damien Ashford was dangerous, not in the way people warned her about, but in the way that truly mattered. He had the power to reach inside her and touch something fragile, something she had buried long ago. And that terrified her. "Celine," he said, his voice softer now, the teasing edge replaced with something raw and sincere. "I don't want to play games with you. I want you. All of you." Her breath hitched, and she looked away, staring at the flickering candle between them. "You don't know what you're asking for." "I know exactly what I'm asking for." He reached across the table then, his fingers grazing hers. A simple touch, yet it sent fire through her veins. "Just give me one night. No rules, no power plays. Just you and me." Celine stared at their hands, at the way his thumb lightly traced over her knuckles. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her resolve crumbling with every passing second. One night, she could give him that. She could give them that. Her lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. One night. Damien exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath. A slow grin curved his lips, but it wasn't arrogant or cocky. It was something else, something filled with longing and relief all at once. He lifted her hand, pressing a lingering kiss to her fingers. The heat of his lips burned into her skin, sending a tremor through her body. "That's all I need to make you mine." And deep down, in the part of her heart she rarely listened to, Celine knew he was right. The night stretched before them, heavy with promise, with unspoken confessions waiting to be unraveled. As Damien poured them another glass of wine, as his gaze traced the contours of her face with a quiet reverence, Celine let herself believe, just for tonight, that she could surrender, just for tonight, she could be his. The city skyline shimmered beneath the moonlight, casting a soft glow over the rooftop lounge. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of lavender and the distant hum of the city below. Celine's pulse thrummed in her ears as she let Damien lead her toward the luxurious suite that loomed just beyond the terrace. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though her body knew what was coming before her mind could fully accept it. Damien's grip on her hand was firm but gentle. His fingers laced through hers, as though he had no intention of letting go. It was unnerving, the way he held her as if she was something precious, something worth holding on to. And yet, a part of her ached for it. Ached for the way he looked at her, not as the powerful CEO of Ashford Enterprises, but as a woman he wanted. He stopped just outside the suite door, his piercing gaze searching hers. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Celine hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Every warning she had ever told herself, every rule she had meticulously crafted over the years, teetered on the edge of destruction. But standing here, with Damien's warmth enveloping her and his eyes dark with unspoken promises, she knew there was no going back. "Yes," she whispered. A slow, knowing smile curved Damien's lips before he turned the handle, pushing the door open. The suite was bathed in warm, golden light, a fire crackling in the corner, casting flickering shadows against the plush, modern decor. It smelled of amber and cedar, a rich, intoxicating scent that wrapped around her senses. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, something shifted in the air between them. The tension that had been simmering for weeks, the stolen glances, the unspoken words, all came crashing down in one unstoppable force. Before she could think, before she could doubt, Damien closed the distance between them, his hands cupping her face as he pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't desperate. It was slow, deliberate. A kiss meant to be savored. His lips moved against hers with a tenderness that sent a shiver down her spine. Celine's hands found their way to his chest, fisting the fabric of his blazer as he deepened the kiss, his tongue sweeping against hers in a languid dance that left her breathless. Damien pulled back just enough to whisper against her lips, "You have no idea how long I've wanted this." Her heart thundered in response. "Then show me," she murmured. A growl of satisfaction rumbled in his throat as he guided her toward the sleek leather couch by the fireplace. The room was bathed in golden light, the flames casting an ethereal glow over their entwined bodies. Damien's fingers traced the line of her jaw, down the column of her throat, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. "You're exquisite," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. "Every inch of you." Celine felt herself unravel beneath his touch. Her walls, ones she had so carefully constructed, crumbled with every kiss, every whispered word against her skin. Damien wasn't just touching her body, he was touching something deeper, something she had long kept locked away. His hands roamed lower, skimming the curves of her body as if memorizing every inch. He took his time, savoring every reaction, every shuddered breath. Celine arched into him, a soft gasp escaping her lips as his lips trailed down the curve of her neck, lingering just below her ear. "Damien!" she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his gaze dark with need, but laced with something deeper, something raw. "I need you to understand something," he said, his thumb tracing circles against her hip. "This isn't just desire for me. It's you. It's always been you." Celine's breath hitched. No one had ever said words like that to her before. No one had ever looked at her like Damien did, as though she was the only thing that mattered in the world. It terrified her. It thrilled her. She reached up, threading her fingers through his hair, pulling him closer. "Then show me," she whispered again, her voice shaking with anticipation. And he did. Damien claimed her with a reverence that left her undone. Each kiss, each caress was a promise, one she knew she was dangerously close to believing in. Time ceased to exist as they lost themselves in each other, their bodies entwined, their hearts racing in unison. There was no past, no future, only this moment, only them. Hours passed in a blur of whispered confessions and lingering touches. And when the fire had burned down to embers, when they lay tangled in the silk sheets, their breath still uneven, Celine knew the truth she had been avoiding for so long. This wasn't just a night of surrender. It was the beginning of something she could no longer control. As Damien pressed a lingering kiss to her shoulder, whispering her name in the darkness, Celine closed her eyes and let herself believe, if only for this night, that she was his. And that terrified her more than anything else ever had. She had spent years building a fortress around her heart, convinced that love was a weakness, an illusion that only led to pain. But Damien, he made her want to believe. He made her want to risk everything. "Don't run from this," he murmured against her skin, his arms tightening around her. "Not from me." Celine swallowed hard, knowing deep down that she had already lost the battle. Because in this moment, wrapped in his warmth, she realized something undeniable. She didn't want to run. For the first time in her life, she wanted to stay. Celine's heart pounded as Damien's hands roamed her body, igniting every nerve ending. The walls she had spent years building crumbled under his touch, and for once, she didn't care. She didn't want to think about consequences or what tomorrow would bring. Tonight, she wanted to be his, and his alone. Their lips met in a fervent clash of passion and hunger. Damien's arms tightened around her, lifting her effortlessly as he carried her to the bed. His gaze burned into hers, searching for any hesitation. But Celine met him with equal intensity, her fingers threading through his hair as she pulled him down to her. "I've wanted this for so long," Damien murmured against her skin, pressing kisses down her neck. "Tell me you want this too." Celine's breath hitched, her body betraying her with every shiver of pleasure. "I do," she whispered, her hands tracing the hard muscles of his back. "I want you, Damien." A slow, satisfied smile curved his lips before he claimed her mouth again. The world outside faded away, leaving only the heat between them, the desperate need that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Hours passed in a blur of heated touches and whispered confessions. They explored each other with an urgency that spoke of years of restraint finally snapping. Celine had never felt this way before, completely lost in another person, drowning in pleasure and emotion all at once. As they lay tangled in each other's arms afterward, their breath still heavy, Damien ran a hand down her back, pulling her closer. "You're incredible," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And now that I've had you, I don't think I can ever let you go." Celine's fingers traced the outline of his jaw, her heart swelling with something dangerously close to love. "Then don't," she said softly, surprising even herself with the admission. Damien's eyes darkened with emotion as he cupped her face. "You're mine, Celine, and I'm yours." She smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. "Then we're in this together." As the night deepened, they held each other close, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side, bound not just by desire, but by something far stronger. The first hints of morning crept through the sheer curtains, casting delicate golden streaks across the room. The soft glow illuminated the tangled sheets, the lingering warmth of passion still clinging to the air like an unspoken promise. Celine stirred slightly, her body cocooned in the protective embrace of Damien, his steady breathing lulling her into a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her head rested against his bare chest, the rhythmic thumping of his heartbeat, grounding her in the reality of this moment. A moment she hadn't dared to dream of. A moment she feared wouldn't last. She tilted her face slightly, her gaze tracing the strong line of his jaw, the tousled dark locks falling lazily over his forehead, the soft parting of his lips as he lay in the peaceful realm between sleep and wakefulness. For a man who carried the weight of dominance and power, in this moment he looked vulnerable, undeniably beautiful in his quiet surrender to sleep. A lazy smile tugged at her lips as she brushed her fingers along his cheek, barely grazing his skin. The sensation was enough to stir him. His breath hitched, his arms instinctively pulling her closer, as though his body recognized hers, even before his mind had fully woken. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing the deep storm of emotions hidden within those midnight blue eyes. The second his gaze met hers, a slow smile spread across his lips. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, his voice husky from sleep, sending a delicious shiver down her spine. Celine's fingers traced small patterns over his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her touch. "Good morning," she whispered in return, her voice barely louder than the whisper of the wind outside. For a while, they simply lay there, wrapped in each other, the world outside forgotten. The room felt like its own universe, just the two of them, untouched by time, by reality, by the responsibilities that awaited them beyond these walls. She had always believed that love was dangerous, that it weakened, that it left you exposed to destruction. But here, in Damien's arms, she had never felt stronger. As if sensing the depth of her thoughts, Damien lifted a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb grazing along her skin. "Last night wasn't just passion for me, Celine," he admitted, his voice firm yet laced with tenderness. "It was everything." Her heart clenched at the sincerity in his words. She had spent so long convincing herself that what they shared was fleeting, a momentary distraction from the chaos of their lives. But the truth was undeniable. She was his, and he was hers. No more running, no more denying. "For me too," she whispered, her voice almost breaking under the weight of her emotions. "I don't want to fight this anymore, Damien. I want us." A flicker of relief flashed in his eyes, followed by something deeper, something primal, possessive. He tightened his hold on her, as if making sure she wouldn't disappear, as if he had been waiting for these words longer than he'd ever admit. "Then stay," he breathed, his lips hovering just above hers. "Be mine, forever." Celine felt the breath catch in her throat. The magnitude of his words settled deep in her chest, filling the hollow spaces she had carried for far too long. This man, the one she had tried to keep at a distance, the one she had convinced herself was too dangerous to love, had become her safe place, her home. A single tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Damien caught it with his thumb, his eyes darkening with something indescribable. "I love you, Celine," he said, his voice unwavering, "and I won't ever stop." A soft laugh escaped her lips, one of pure joy, pure release. She had spent so long afraid of these words, afraid of what they meant, but now they felt like the easiest thing in the world to say back. "I love you too, Damien," she whispered, pressing her palm against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. "So much." Damien exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding forever. Then, without hesitation, he claimed her lips in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with every unsaid promise between them. His hands framed her face, his fingers tangling in her hair, as if he wanted to imprint this moment into his soul. When they finally pulled apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers, his voice low and possessive. "You're mine," he murmured, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips, "and I'm never letting you go." Celine closed her eyes, reveling in the warmth of his embrace, in the certainty of his words. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of love. She wasn't afraid of being vulnerable, because in Damien's arms she had found something more powerful than fear. She had found home. The world outside continued on, the sun rising higher, casting new light upon the city. But for Celine and Damien, nothing else existed in this moment, nothing else mattered. This was only the beginning of their forever. The waves kissed the shore with a gentle caress, their melody blending seamlessly with the whisper of the wind through the palm trees. The sky had transformed into a breathtaking canvas of gold, pink, and violet as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the secluded beach. Celine stood near the water's edge, her bare feet sinking into the soft, cool sand. The salty breeze tousled her hair, and she inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle deep into her soul. She had always found solace in control, in logic, in carefully calculated steps. But standing here, wrapped in the beauty of the moment, she realized that the best things in life, the most important things, were never planned. And Damien was proof of that. A few steps away, Damien stood with his hands in his pockets, gazing out at the horizon. His expression was unreadable, but the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths, it told her everything. He was happy. He turned then, as if sensing her eyes on him, and when their gazes met, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. It was the kind of smile that melted every barrier she had ever built, the kind of smile that had changed everything. "You're staring again, Miss Lancaster," he teased, stepping toward her. Celine smirked, tilting her head. "And if I am..." His eyes gleamed with something soft, something unspoken yet deeply felt. "Then it means you're just as hopelessly in love with me as I am with you." Her heart swelled at his words. Love had never been easy for her. She had spent years convincing herself that it was a distraction, a weakness she couldn't afford. But Damien had shattered every single one of those fears, not with force, but with patience, with unwavering devotion, with the kind of love that didn't ask her to change, but made her want to. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers as he gently pulled her closer. "You know, I used to believe that love was temporary, that it always faded, no matter how strong it seemed in the beginning." His voice softened as he brushed his thumb across her knuckles. "But then you happened, and suddenly nothing else made sense except loving you." Celine swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "Damien." He silenced her by lifting her hand to his lips, pressing a lingering kiss to her fingers. "With you, I don't have to be anything but myself. I don't have to play games, wear masks, or pretend that I don't care." His voice grew even softer, more vulnerable. "And I don't ever want to go another day without reminding you just how much I love you." Tears welled in her eyes, and for once she didn't try to stop them. She had spent so long running, so long afraid of feeling too much, of letting someone in. But standing here, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, she knew the truth. She wasn't afraid anymore. She lifted her other hand, cradling his face between her palms. "Damien, you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. And I wasted so much time fighting what was right in front of me." Her voice broke slightly, but she kept going. "I don't want to waste another second." A flicker of emotion passed through his eyes. Hope, love, something deeper, something infinite. "Then don't," he whispered. Celine exhaled shakily, the words tumbling from her lips before she could stop them. "I love you, Damien, with every piece of me, with every breath, every heartbeat. I love you." A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face, and he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "Say it again," he murmured against her forehead. She laughed softly, blinking away the tears. "I love you." Damien's grip tightened, as if those words had anchored something inside him. "I love you too, Celine," he whispered, "and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it." She had never believed in forever. Forever was unpredictable, uncertain, but with Damien, forever didn't feel like a question. It felt like a promise, and she was ready to keep it. A year later, the grand estate overlooked a sprawling vineyard, the air thick with the scent of roses and fresh earth. Twinkling fairy lights were strung between the towering oak trees, casting a warm glow over the gathering of friends and family. Laughter and soft music blended into the night, creating a dreamlike atmosphere. Celine stood before a large window, watching the gentle flicker of candles illuminating the garden below. Her wedding dress shimmered in the low light, the delicate lace hugging her figure before flowing down in soft waves. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her veil, her heart hammering with a mixture of excitement and anticipation. The door behind her opened, and she turned to find Damien standing there, dressed in a tailored black suit that fit him perfectly. His eyes roamed over her, and for a moment he just stood there, as if trying to memorize every detail. "You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony," Celine teased, though her voice wavered with emotion. Damien smirked. "Rules never really applied to us, did they?" She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "No, I suppose they didn't." He stepped closer, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You look beautiful," he murmured. She felt the warmth of his touch, the steady presence of him grounding her in a way nothing else ever could. "And you, Damien Blackwood, are about to become my husband." His lips curved into a slow, tender smile. "And you, Selina Lancaster, are about to become my wife." A lump formed in her throat, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd have this," she admitted. I never thought I'd find someone who saw every part of me and still chose to stay. Damien cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. Then let me remind you every single day that you are worth loving, that you are worth